right, hi guys, welcome to the debate. Today's motion is this House will hold a referendum on the death penalty. Let's start by introducing the teams. We have, going first, we have points of information consisting of Anirudh and Arav. Then we have not applicable, which is Avyay and Dhruv. Second last, we have losers, which is Devam and Ayush. And last but not least, we have Dynamo twice, which is Pradyum and Anik. We'll have Suryansh on later to tell you about Safar. But in the meantime, let's get started. First speaker for first team is Anirudh. Anirudh, go ahead.
Yeah, am I both audible and visible?
Yeah.
The topic placed before me reads, the House would hold a referendum on the death penalty, and as the first speaker, it is my duty to define the key terms of the motion, which are referendum and death penalty. Referendum can be defined as a general vote by the electorate on a single political question, which has been referred to them for a direct decision. And death penalty simply means punishment by execution. In a democracy with government of the people, by the people, and for the people, the rules and laws that govern the people should be as per their wants and suggestions. It should be upon us to decide whether or not we want the death penalty, and that can be done through a referendum. A referendum is a perfect process to decide whether or not we want a referendum, because it is a process of direct democracy. The voice of the people is heard. It is us who decide what is best for us in this situation. To abolish or reinstate death penalty, it must be reflected to the government that whether death penalty is justified or not, and for that we need to know what the people think, and for that referendum is essential. In such a crucial matter, having an institutionalized deliberation in the legislative assembly by the politicians will not work for obvious biasness due to vote bank politics and other obvious reasons. This law can affect anyone, and so the opinion of each and every citizen should be necessary. And it is such a controversial and vital decision that it can cause riots and conflicts after the decision has been made. But if we have a referendum where the people make the choice whether or not they want to have a referendum, these things can be stopped. Then they won't revolt or cause conflicts that a wrong decision has been made, because they themselves have made this decision. And for centuries they have been deliberating that whether or not we should have death penalty. But if we have a referendum, immediate decision will be taken, because the decision after the decision has been made. On the other hand, the against speakers might come up and say that the population of India is not educated enough to take such decisions. But before we have a referendum, several referendum campaigns will take place, which will explain to the mass both the positive and negative aspect of the referendum, why we need to have death penalty and why we don't need to have the referendum. So people will have the knowledge of why they should vote for death penalty or why they should not vote for death penalty. Lastly, 14 countries have had referendum on the death penalty since the 20th century. And I would like to end my speech by a quote by the president of Belarus. The issue of death penalty can only be resolved by a referendum. Thank you. With this, I am very proud to propose.
All right. Thanks, Anirudh. You still have 1 minute left. Do you wish to go on, or is that it?
That's it.
All right. All right. Let's move on to the next speakers.
Riddhi, I just have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Taking questions from the spectators right now or at the end of the debate?
We're taking it at the end of the debate because I believe that's how Suryansh does it.
Right. Okay.
All right. Okay. Guys, we're doing questions after both speakers. So please raise your hand then and not so much in advance. Let's have the next speaker from Points of Information, Arav. Arav, you have 4 minutes.
Am I audible?
You are audible. Yes.
Right. So good evening, everyone. The topic placed before us reads that this House will hold a referendum on the death penalty, and I will speak against this motion. So what is a death penalty? It is a government-sanctioned practice whereby a person is put to death as a a punishment for a crime that he or she has committed. Now, the first word of this definition reaffirms that this punishment is a government mandated punishment. It is a government issued punishment, and this punishment is only and completely in the hands of the government, and public opinion should not be given much weightage in this scenario. Now, the speakers of side proposition might come up and say the ideals of democracy state that the government should be for the people, of the people, and by the people. So now, if you consider a country like India, where the legislative bodies are considered to be a miniature form of the country, where the lawmakers are elected by the citizens belonging to a particular constituency, and they are elected because the lawmakers share a common point of view, they share common opinions, and they hope that their opinions will be reflected on these government rulings or in the legislative assembly, and inherently their public opinions will be taken into consideration when these ideas are being pitched in to the higher authority of the government. Now, moving on to my second point, when we look at the term high profile killings, eminent personality A murders an eminent personality B, what is the first thing that comes into mind when we take this scenario? We have a lot of press attention, we have excessive police investigations, and most importantly, we have a varying public opinion. So now, when we look at that, public will have several opinions based on what the media portrays. Whatever the media says, the public will follow. Whatever the media thinks is correct, the public will also think. Destroys the purpose of a fair and transparent ruling in order to decide the punishment that is meted out towards the person who was charged for a particular crime. And to prevent this, there should be government mandated court proceedings in order to ensure proper punishment which should be given to these crime offenders. So now, related to this, when we look at big crime organizations such as the Sicilian mob or the Yamaguchi, that these crime organizations have a huge number of members which are scattered around several places in the same country in which their membership is active. So now, when we look at this in this way, we will understand that these people may inherently force their opinions, may force the people belonging to the country in not to vote for this referendum in order to save their bosses, in order to save their top brass from getting killed. Now, with the aforementioned points, I hope I've convinced you that about the evils of taking this issue to the public, and I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks, Ara.
With that, the first team points of information have proposed and opposed the motion and opened the arguments for both sides. With the first speaker, Anirudh, talking about giving the power to the people and how this will help the system, and also about how suggested measures as to with respect to a referendum. And Arav opposed some of those points very well, where he spoke about media influence and the influence of violent organizations like the Sicilian mob, etc. Now we'll hand over the floor to the next team, which is not applicable, NA. And the first speaker we have
Yash, one sec. We still have rebuttals left.
I'm sorry.
So it's fine, it's fine. Let's do rebuttals. Questions for Anirudh. Dhruv and Avya have raised their hands, so whoever wants to take the first question.
Dhruv, you can go ahead with the first one.
So you in your speech said that we should hold referendums. We should hold referendums, which in itself is economically outrageous. Apart from that, you also suggest holding referendum campaigns before that. So how do you justify the economic impact it will have on our government? And secondly, don't you believe where do you draw the line? If we are having referendums for death penalties, what is there for us to stop having death penalties for having referendums for situations such as the loans given to the farmers of Uttar Pradesh or the CA or the I didn't get the second part of your question. I couldn't hear the second part of your question.
Right. So the second part of my question entails very shortly about where do we draw the line? You said that we should have referendums for death penalties. What is there for us to stop to have referendums for something such as loans given to farmers in Uttar Pradesh or the CAA/NRC? So, like, according to your logic, we should have referendums for each and everything, and that isn't.
All right,
So
I believe that's been asked. Yeah.
Yeah. So something such as a death penalty and loans given to farmers, the intensity and the amount, the weightage given to both these cases are different. Or here, a life of a person is at risk, and here we're just giving loans to farmers. So obviously, in such a vital and crucial case, we need public opinion. The government needs to bear such a huge economic outflow, and the government needs to decide that whether or not public opinion is required in such a vital point. The public opinion is required in case of loans given to farmers. I don't think public opinion is required. The government is well competent to decide on such matters. Thank you.
May I ask my question?
All right. Avya?
Yes, thank you. A majority of your speech was based on how the determine what policies they want to enact. So then what is the point of having a referendum on this specific topic when it's a political issue and can simply be brought up during election time?
So
Go out of our way to do an entire referendum on this one topic when it can be done through an election.
So the entire purpose of a referendum is to vote on a single political question. It is to know what the public feels about that political question and what the public wants, so that the government can take decisions on the basis of that.
Fair enough.
Everything cannot be decided by the government. We need public.
Okay. Guys, at this point, I'll just remind you, keep your questions and answers short. There's a 30-second cap on asking questions and a 1-minute cap on answering them. Devam and Ayush have already raised hand, so we're going to go with Devam first.
My question is to the opposition speaker. Sir, you talked about how every policymaker always keeps. Why the CA NRC levied, sir? Why was the demonetization policy levied? Why was the National Data Protection Bill levied? And sir, I realize the fact that exceptions don't make a rule, but sir, when the number of exceptions increase the number of rules, sir, don't you think it's something beyond the care of the policymakers?
So could you repeat your question? Your voice is cracking in the end. I couldn't.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sir, you talked about how the policymakers always take the national interest in concern. Sir, why was the CA NRC levied? Why was the National Data Protection Bill levied? And sir, I understand that exceptions don't make a rule, but sir, when the number of exceptions are more than the number of rules, the whole thing changes.
Right. So when the topic in focus here is a death penalty, and what you're talking about is demonetization and acts that have been levied by the government. So now we need to understand that these acts can only be passed by the governing bodies of the country. We can't have the public passing out the acts that you mentioned. This is a death penalty, and this is the question for the life of a person, and that is all. And when we talk about acts that have been mentioned, we can't just have public opinion on them, because inherently there will be varying opinions existing within the public.
All right, thanks, Arav. Suryansh, are you here?
Yes, I'm back. Thank you, Riddhi. I had some internet issues, which is why I couldn't be here for the start of it. So, all right.
No worries. Arav just has one question left from the house, and then we can move on to next team.
Yeah.
Right, should I begin with the question? Since I believe I was recognized, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is to the proposition, which I believe is Anirudh. Right, so you spoke about vote bank politics, right? So do you think vote bank population would not also inflict a biased vote on those certain referendums too?
Right, Anirudh, are you with us? I think Ayush will have to save Anirudh, your question to Anirudh for later, because I think he too is having internet issues now. So I think we'll save that for later. Did Riddhi or Yash have a question to either of the speakers?
Considering the fact that Arav got only one question and Ayush's question is directed towards Anirudh, can I ask my question to Arav?
Riddhi, can you can make the decision because I wasn't sure. Yeah.
Pradyum, go ahead for a question with a question for Arav.
Yes,
I'm back.
Anirudh is back.
All right.
So you spoke about how certain mobs in certain countries will force the people to vote against the death penalty, so they will not get executed when the government imposes the death penalty. So, however, you cannot just determine that the government will vote against against the death penalty. The government and in those cases, the death penalty will not be there, and it will be in the interest of the mobs themselves. So how can you determine that the government will vote against the death penalty? Or not?
So could you repeat your question, please?
So you simply stated that certain mobs in certain countries might force the people to vote against the death penalty, so they may not be executed when they commit crimes. However, how can you determine that the government will vote against the death will vote for the death penalty when there are certain governments voting for the abolition of the death penalty are going down?
Right. So a referendum is entirely, the purpose of a referendum is entirely to voice the opinions of the public in order to facilitate a political action. So if the entire if members of a certain crime organization influence the public in a way that they will vote against the execution of one particular leader, which inherently will be in the best interest of the crime organization in order to operations even after this death penalty is abolished. So I believe I've answered your question.
Hopefully you have. Riddhi, is that all for the questions on their speeches?
Ayush had a question for Anirudh which wasn't answered. So now that Anirudh's back, I think we can go ahead and do that.
Ayush, go ahead.
Right. So, Anirudh, you spoke about like the virtues or vices of vote bank politics, right? So, do you think or
We get to know the consequences of having death penalty and what are the benefits of having a death penalty and what are the benefits are educated and they know the pros and cons of death penalty, then they will go for a referendum and vote. Thank you.
Follow
up? Suryansh, that's up to you. That's your call.
Sure, Ayush, go ahead.
Okay, so not all opinions are based on education, right? So there are also religious, cultural, and religious and cultural opinions that can be seen as bias. So would you still think that can determine their vote?
So when we talk about death penalty, I don't think religious and cultural bias come into play. It is about whether or not having a death penalty is justified, or whether or not killing a person for a crime he has committed is justified or not. It is not about religious or cultural biases coming into play in a situation of death penalty.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ayush. I hope that answers your question. Yes, Yash.
Is there a provision for the judge to ask
yes,
question?
there is. After every speech, after both the speakers are over, the judges can ask a question to both sides. Yash, your question.
Yeah. So I would just like to go along the same lines that Ayush did about the education point that the first speaker brought up. Who would educate you? You spoke about fixing the education problem with respect to a referendum by providing education to the masses about the death penalty. Now, when you provide education to the masses about something so controversial and debatable, how do you do that without being biased or prejudiced towards one side of the argument? And who is to provide this education? If the government in power does it, then all governments in power have a given bias with respect to the death penalty argument anyway. So if not them, then who will provide the education that you mentioned?
So if not the government in power, I guess the Supreme Court of India will appoint certain learned scholars who have studied death penalty, and they will bring scholars from both for and against side of the mass, both aspects, whether they should have death penalty or whether they shouldn't have the death penalty. And after the people are educated, after the scholars have spoken to them, then they will make decisions. I don't think the government in power should call for scholars to educate the people.
Fair enough. Thank you, Anirudh, and thank you, Yash. We'll now be moving forward with the next team for the debate. Thank you to the Points of Information team. We will now move forward to Not Applicable, represented by both Aved Tulsian and Dhruv Saraf. Proposition and opposition speaker.
I'm going off proposition, so I'll be speaking first.
Right. So Dhruv, like the others, you will have 4 minutes to speak. Are you ready?
Yes.
Well, the floor is yours.
The opinion of the public shouldn't be given weightage. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not quoting any famous personality. I'm quoting the first speaker of side opposition, which very clearly epitomizes how baseless the argument on their side of the house is. Good evening to respected chairpersons, sir, honorable judges, members of the house, and of course, my most worthy. This house would hold a referendum on the death penalty, and I, as a member of side proposition, will prove to you how true and valid the motion really is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's understand what exactly a referendum is. A referendum is something which may or may not be legally binding, and thus all points brought up by side opposition about how it is placing too much power into the hands of the public does not stand. Ladies and gentlemen, the legislature should be responsible for these things, and which is why a referendum which is being held is not a black and white thing about whether it should be banned or whether it should be reinstated. Today, understand that referendums don't necessarily have to say whether death penalty should be clearly banned or whether it should be clearly reinstated. We can also speak about the intricacies of death penalty and get the general opinion on this hugely controversial matter. Today, as side proposition, we aren't in support or against this dispute, which we are just saying that holding a referendum with regard to this dispute will help us get a clear and cohesive view, which will thus enable assessing the economic impact of holding such a referendum. Speakers from the opposition will harp on how unfeasible it is to do it, considering the large population of the country, and also about how large amount of money will be drained. Ladies and gentlemen, I have one refutation to that. Back in 2001, a spokesperson from the Department of Justice of the Irish government said that a referendum on the issue would be held at the same time as the referendum to the ratification of the Treaty of Nice and the general elections. We too today could adopt a similar fashion, thereby cutting down on the do is we can hold the general elections and the referendum on such an issue at the very same time, and thus the economic aspect of all the things brought up by side opposition will be negated. Having deconstructed two major points brought up by side opposition, I would now like to bring to you my side of the house, and I would like to prove to you how side proposition saying that the sun is brighter on their side of the land is completely baseless. Under the law, death penalty is applicable under certain circumstances. A referendum could be used to alter those qualifications by the public to suit the public desires of that particular point in time. Apart from this, referendum will not only help eliminate political vendetta, but it will also provide a level of political support for the difficult decision. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a difficult decision to make, then a referendum could only solidify support to it. When a majority of the people back a political decision, it helps create a lock in the choice, making it considerably easier to proceed ahead. Apart from this, it will also create specific points of negotiation. The priorities of the politicians may be different from the priorities of the people, and by offering a referendum, the government is able to glean information about what their districts desire. What it also, now ladies and gentlemen, in refutation to what the first speaker of side opposition told us, what he did in essence was followed a policy of an isolated example. What he told us is how certain people would be against this very referendum on the death penalty because certain people might be hanged as the result of it. Now, what we must understand is that the number of people who have been faced under the death penalty has been very, very low. And to say that the referendum should be purely negated because these people might be against the people who are being hanged is completely outrageous. Now, the first speaker also replied to my question, saying that we could easily determine the line by which we should hold a referendum and by which we
Dhruv, I
should not hold a
request you to
referendum.
wrap up.
So, right. So, in my question, I framed to you. I told you about the farmers' loan. So, understand that the farmers' loan situation is a situation of life and death, and many farmers die as a result of it. Which is why, ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very proud to propose today, and I can very, very proud.
Thank you, Dhruv. That was the proposition speaker from Not Applicable. He he made quite a few refutations on the previous team and made them quite strongly, which he developed with his own constructives to support. Thank you, Dhruv, and we will now see what your teammate Ave has to say from the opposition to add to this debate. Ave, are
Yes,
you
am I
with us?
audible?
Right. You are both audible and visible, Ave. You have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
By refuting one of the points which was just brought up about how a referendum is not legally binding. So even if a referendum is not legally binding, it still must end up being followed by the government, because if we have a referendum on a particular issue and then the government, and suppose 60% of people support that and 40% of people are against it, and the government is going to be forced to carry out that action. So it isn't the government can't just say, okay, we understand what the people feel, but we're still not going to do this action. So a referendum may not be legally is a policy dispute. It is a policy issue, and therefore it should simply be part of the electoral cycle. What is the point of taking out this one specific policy dispute and having an entire referendum based on it, instead of allowing the people to make that decision via the election itself, where certain political parties may support the death penalty while other political parties may be against the death penalty? I don't the stance of the holding a referendum on a topic is giving more power to the people, when there is a literal election where that topic plays a role. And if the death penalty is not an issue which ends up being discussed in the election, then that simply means that that the people do not want it to be discussed, because the entire point of having an election is to allow people to discuss and deliberate on certain political issues, certain is on the same level as that, because a referee, you cannot ask a person to you cannot ask the entire population of a country to study up on because if we end up having a referendum on the death penalty, then that sets the precedent for having referendums on other policy disputes, and then that will simply take away the entire point of having the election. Why are we going to sit and discuss which political party we're going to put in power when we're discussing each of their policies one by one? Where do we draw the line? How do we decide, hey, this policy is something which we should leave to the public to decide, and we should make the public go for a vote yes or no on this, while this policy should be decided by the government? Where do we draw the line between that? Why are we talking about having a referendum on the death penalty when we're not going to be having a referendum on much more controversial policy disputes like CA, NRC, the cancellation of loans to farmers in Punjab? There's 100 different policy issues in India and abroad which you cannot disseminate into a referendum, because there are simply so many policy issues, and how you cannot choose which policy issue should be decided on via referendum and which one should not. Additionally, people elect a legislature for the sole purpose of the legislature making these decisions for them. Every time there is a policy issue, every time the legislature has to figure out, hey, should this thing be allowed in our country or not, they can't run to the people and say, hey, you people decide. The
Abhay,
entire
wrap up.
Yes, sir. The entire purpose of the legislature is to make these decisions for the people. And if you're not going to allow the legislature to make these decisions through through their electoral process and through the through their discussions in the legislature, then what is the point? Thank you very much. I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you, Ava. That wraps up the speeches for the not applicable team. I thank Dhruv and Ava for making some very constructive points and speaking so articulately to defend both their stances. Now comes to the scrutiny by the other speakers here today. We will first take questions to the proposition speaker, which was Dhruv, and then move on to the questions to Ave. We will first take questions, as I said, to the proposition, which is Ave. All those with a question, do voice yourselves. We'll take Anirudh's question, followed by Anik. Anirudh, go ahead.
I have question for Dhruv.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So Dhruv said that the Mr. Speaker said that we can have referendums alongside general elections, but don't you think, sir, it will the attention of the people will be focused on the referendum rather than general election, and general election being a very important factor of democracy as it is a very important factor of democracy because we choose the governing body of a country.
So believe me, as long as we have this certain entity called Mr. Narendra Modi in our country, the importance of referendum for any other thing. What you must understand, what I did say in my speech was how a referendum should be used as a complement to the general election so that the cost can be significantly cut down. As far as the general elections part of it is concerned, it will obviously be more important and will obviously be very, very important because, as I said, all these political parties and especially Narendra Modi will focus a large part of their funds to sway public opinion, and hence the major topic under contention and heated debate elections.
Right. Dhruv, could you repeat the last part of your answer, please? The last line, because your audio cut out then we couldn't get you.
So basically what I said was how as long as we have these political parties who do spend.
Right. I think what I inferred from Dhruv, I had to say is that as long as certain political parties, and he mentioned Narendra Modi specifically, are here, it is not something that is achievable. Right. Hopefully,
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. I think, yeah, I think I summarized what you had to say, Dhruv. Hopefully, and we'll take next Anik's question towards you. Anik, go ahead.
Okay, so in your speech, given how you have strongly supported that you would like a referendum, knowing that India has nearly 313 million illiterate people, how would you propose to have an unbiased referendum with concrete results?
Right, yeah.
I don't think Anik. I don't think Dhruv's internet is very
I'll
stable
repeat my
right now.
question.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, given that India has nearly 313 million illiterate people, how would you propose to have an unbiased election wherein people make rational decisions and have a concrete result?
Right, Anik, I will keep that question in mind and we'll move on to Ava for now. Hopefully by that time, Dhruv's internet comes back. So we'll take all the questions to Ava for now. And once we can, we'll ask Dhruv to answer your question. Don't worry, we'll get to it. Right. Now we'll be. Yes, you okay? Dhruv is back on the buzzer. Dhruv, so Anik, could you repeat your question once again for Dhruv's benefit because he had internet issues?
Okay, sure. So, sir, my question was that given that India has nearly 313 million illiterate people, how would you propose having an unbiased referendum with rational voting and having concrete results?
So by that logic, we shouldn't have elections as a whole, because when we take into account these 330 million people voting in an election, and we have these 330 million people voting in a referendum, there will be some amount of bias everywhere. There will be some amount of, I mean, the society isn't exactly benevolent, and everything is not tipped to the balance, right? So there will be some amount of negative towards everything. But what you must realize is that the larger benefit is way out. The pros of this referendum outweigh the cons.
Can I have a follow-up, please, sir?
Yes, you may.
Given that during elections there is a large amount of campaigning beforehand, wherein the leaders discuss their agendas and their policies with the general people, how would this happen in a referendum?
A referendum would definitely not have the amount of money devoted to it as certain political parties do devote to campaigning for their own political parties. But what you must realize is that despite of all the things, despite the economic aspect of it, having a referendum for even a fraction of society, for even a large fraction of society, if you have to dismiss a certain small proportion of society, is justified.
Right, fair enough. Thank you, Dhruv. I hope that answers the question, Anik. I hope the judges got that as well. Before we move on to Aves's questions, we'll take questions from both the judges. Riddhi or Yash, do either of you have questions towards our two speakers?
I have a question for Dhruv. Yeah.
Right, go ahead.
Dhruv, your entire argument was centered around the principle that a referendum accurately represents public opinion. Are you not taking into account the fact that references can be skewed too, as we have seen in the past during Brexit? Because a large number of young voters didn't turn out, and that led the result to a different direction than everyone had expected it to. By what measure can you say for sure that a referendum will not be biased or skewed and the turnout will accurately represent public opinion on a matter?
Ma'am, something is better than nothing, right? So we can't have 100% accurate measure of a public opinion on anything. But even if we do have a certain measure by which we can determine the public opinion on a certain thing, or 95% accurate on the basis of how many people turn up, still we might have a general idea of what the public thinks about it, and that will help frame the parties and the government's policies to such a heated argument.
Fair enough.
Right, fair enough. Thank you, Dhruv and Riddhi. I hope that answers your question. Yash, do you have a question to Dhruv?
No, I don't. I think Riddhi asked my question.
All right, fair enough. That works out well. We'll now take questions towards Aved, the opposition speaker. Thank you, Dhruv. We'll take first Devam's question, followed by Pradyum.
Sir, the entire crux of his speech was based on the fact that if we are going to have a referendum, what's the point of having an election? Right, sir, don't you think that there is a very strong and a bold line of demarcation between who you prefer to be the head of the government and what decision does he make?
Okay, thank you for your questions. I'd like to begin by clearing up the first statement. My speech wasn't about if we have referendums, what's the point of holding an election? My speech was based on the fact that if we have a referendum on policy, then why will we be having a referendum on this policy and not the 500 other policies? And if we end up having a referendum on all 500 policies, then there's no point of an election. But leaving that aside, to answer your question, there may be a factor in who you're choosing to run your government, and I think that in addition to their policies plays into your decision when you're choosing them in an election. Because when you are voting for a particular political leader for to be the head of your government, you're not only voting for that political leader because that political leader is the person they are, and because you think that political leader is going to work hard, but actually because of the policies
I will
which
wrap up.
yes, I'm
Yeah.
wrapping up. But because of the policies which that political leader represents, and if you have a referendum on the policies which the political leader represents, then it somewhat takes away from the crux of the election, and it's not possible to determine which policies should be put as part of that referendum and which policies should.
Fair enough. Thank you, Ave. Devam, I hope that answers your question. We'll now be taking Pradyum's question towards Ave. Pradyum, go ahead.
So you spoke about in your speech and in your answer to Devam's question that the death penalty is already discussed in while the election campaign is going on, and when you vote for a political candidate, you also vote for his policy. However, the death penalty alone does not define election campaigns. There are many other factors like the economic plan, immigration, what the government wants to do in accordance to the communal disputes. So don't you think those might hold some weightage over that? Like those might hold weightage as same amount as the death penalty, and the death penalty policy may be overlooked while you're voting for a political candidate in terms of these parameters.
Yes, sir. So that was another point which I made very clearly in my speech, that there are 500 different policy aspects which go into making a decision when you're choosing a political candidate. And that is the essential point which I'm trying to make. Because since there are so many different policies, why should we take the death penalty out of all of those 500 policies and have a referendum on that? And as you said, not have a referendum on economic policy, on immigration, on CA, NRC, which was something which I brought up in my speech, even though you didn't say it right now. Why should we have a referendum only on the death penalty and not on all of these other things? What separates the death penalty as a policy issue from all of these other issues? Because the death penalty obviously affects lives, and at the
Right.
same time, all of these other
Dhruv,
policy issues
Ave,
are going to affect lives. Yeah, thank
right.
you.
Fair enough. That is understood, Ave. Point well made. I hope that answers your question, Pradyum. Riddhi or Yash, do either of you have a question towards Ave?
Yeah, actually, I do have a question.
Right. Ave, we have one more question for you. Yash, go ahead.
Yeah, so firstly, it seems to me like your entire speech opposed the concept of a referendum as a whole, because all referendums are essentially normally for policy decisions, and according to you, a general election covers all policy recommendations that every candidate brings to the table, and therefore it seems to me like you oppose the concept of referendums as a whole for any issue at all. So I'd like some clarification about that. And other than that, yeah, actually, I think that's about it.
Yeah. So no, sir, I don't oppose the concept of a referendum as a whole. I stated in my speech, I think you may have missed it, so I'd like to repeat it for clarification. I stated very clearly that there are issues which are of a much greater magnitude than the death penalty, and those policy issues are normally the ones which are put to a referendum. My question, a very clear question I brought out in my speech was, why are we picking the death penalty and not debating about CA and RC through a referendum? Not talking about economic policy or particular economic policy through a referendum, not talking about immigration through a referendum, not talking about gun control through a referendum. There are so many different policy decisions which need to be made. Why is the death penalty plucked out of all of those policies and put as part of a referendum? Why? What gives the death? Nothing gives the death penalty that absolute importance that it is the end all and be all of all policies, and therefore needs to be put as part of a referendum. In other countries like in the United Kingdom, when Brexit
Ave,
was,
I request you to
Thank
wrap up.
you.
this is a very important point I'd like to make. It'll just take me 2 sentences. In the United Kingdom, when Brexit was put as the topic of the referendum, the reason it was put as part of the referendum is because it affected immigration policy, it affected people's jobs, it affected people's lives, and it would have a tremendous impact on every citizen of that country. So the point which I was trying to make is that unless something is of that absolute magnitude, it cannot be distinguished from all other policies and put as
Yeah.
part of.
So essentially, Brexit and any example you take along those lines will be a referendum on acceding from a particular body or country or organization and therefore those will have direct impacts like that. But if something is not about acceding from a certain body, then should a referendum not be held on it individually at all, and should everything be considered to be covered under the general elections?
So
And I think
that
Riddhi also, before you answer that, I think Riddhi also has a follow up.
Yeah,
yes,
Yash, I think that's about it. Because you seem to be taking a moral high ground and deciding that this issue is not as important as others. So, what issues, if any, would you think are not covered under a general election? What issues are important enough in your perspective to have a referendum about?
well, there are certain issues in some countries which end up taking over the entirety of the political spectrum, like Brexit in the United Kingdom, which became the central policy dispute, and therefore a referendum on that was made necessary. If you look at India right now, it might be the CAA, which was such a controversial policy that maybe a referendum on that could be acceptable. But if we end up plucking out policies like the death penalty, which aren't nearly as controversial, or rather as heavily discussed or as important in the political spectrum, and we put that as a as the topic of referendum, I don't understand why that distinction is being made between the death penalty and other policy issues.
Right, fair enough. Aga, thank you for answering. I hope that clarifies your doubts, Riddhi and Yash. We'll now be moving forward with the next team. So I thank the speakers from Not Applicable for making their speeches and answering the multitude of questions that were posed towards them. And the team that will be going next is the team of, well, as they call themselves, the losers. And they're represented by both Ayush Gupta and Devam Sarkar. I request both the speakers to identify their proposition and opposition speakers.
I'll be the proposition speaker. Sir, shall I start?
Right. Yes, Devam, you have 4 minutes on the clock. You may begin.
So hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Devam Sarkar, and I'll be going proposition to the particular agenda item at hand. I understand that the way I'll be going about with this speech is a bit different, while all other proposition speakers try to make us understand that why is a referendum in this particular regard correct. I'll be trying to explain why it is not wrong, right? So with that said, let me reiterate something very important. I still remember the Shakti Mills gang rape case, in that after that particular thing was at trial and the verdict, after the press and in the press conference, the mother of the victim was asked that, are you happy with the decision? She said no, because, and then the counter argument was that, ma'am, then that is the justice that has been delivered to you. Why are you not happy? She simply answered by telling that, understand, sir, that democracy is not about what I shall get. Democracy is about what I want to get, right? So with that said, understand that this particular statement completely summarizes the fact that why is a referendum important in the very first place. Understand that the question of referendum going against the legislative democratic ethics of a system does not arise here. So with that said, let me come up to the next question, that this particular question should be left to the judges to make a decision up to, because they are more educated in this matter. Now understand that the question of education does not arise here, because we as a house, our duty is to come up to a conclusion to the fact that whether a referendum is needed or not. Whether the question of education is simply up to the government. It's the duty of the government to come up with educational campaigns and other policies. We as a house have to decide upon the particular motion and the particular policy of having a referendum. Also understand that in case this particular referendum is accepted, the legislative system would not break. The legislative system will still be taken into account, and the demarcation between the fact that when a death penalty should be levied and when it's going to be simply a fine payment is still going to exist. The judges are still going to make the decision that this particular case should be going up to the death penalty, and this particular case should be restricted to the monetary limits itself. Now, another very important question is, wouldn't if this particular referendum comes up as an answer to no, then wouldn't the particular criminals have more incentive to commit more crimes? Understand, ladies and gentlemen, the answer to this is also no, because according to a study conducted by the Oxford University, more than 50% of the criminals, after they commit the crime, have a tendency to die themselves, because when asked, they tell that it's better to die rather than live their whole life in jail. So understand that if the death penalty is abolished, then the crime rates are going to go down. Also, a particular speaker had already also brought up that most of the policymakers take into account public opinion, and as already stated in one of my questions, that it is not something that we see in a democracy as India. And I have also cited the examples of CA, NRC, demonetization policies, the National Data Protection Bill, wherein public opinion was simply not taken into account. Another question is, can't referendum be biased? Because in the Brexit case, we also saw the political vendetta part, how Mr. Boris Johnson had influenced votes. Understand that for this particular referendum, death penalty should be abolished. It's a very moral and an ethical question. The involvement of political vendetta does not come into account. It's a very moral question, and I think the answer to a moral question is something which does not essentially depend upon education. It does not really depend upon legal knowledge. It's a very ethical question. It's a very moral question. Right. Now, I would like to conclude my particular stance by explaining you a very simple concept here. That what is justice for me might not be a justice for you. It's subjective. And when anything is subjective, the best particular option that we have is to conduct a referendum. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I rest my case, but not my stance.
Well, with a very well-structured speech and a very planned-out speech, Devam has ended dot on time. Thank you very much, Devam, for sticking to the time bar. Devam made a very differently structured speech and a very different approach to how this stance must be seen. And it was a very well-put speech. And we will now see what his teammate from the opposition in Ayush Gupta has to say for the opposition. Ayush, are you with us?
Right. So since the motion of the House is that a referendum should be held on the death penalty, I would like to begin by saying referendums are not a good representation of democracy. It gives a false sense of it. Good evening to everyone present. My name is Ayush Gupta and I'll be representing the opposition for the said motion. Right. So I would like to begin by saying that it leaves out a section of society that is in poverty, that is unable or do not see voting as a priority, right? And for the people who do vote and do make their decisions, do it with relatively little information, forcing them to rely on something like political messaging, which puts more power in the hands of political parties, political elites, rather than those voters. Now, a vote is supposed to be of an important public issue, ends up being about the popularity or unpopularity of a particular party or a leader, right? And for some set of issues, the events that are not related to the subject of this referendum. Now, referendums also often distill difficult policy choices down to a simple yes or no. Over a long period of years, political scientists have termed these referendums as shortcuts to policy making. Now, legislators and lawmakers require a certain legal precedent to go forward with legislation, right? Especially on an issue as often deliberated as the death penalty. And if we retain this decision with a simple referendum that is opinionated and not static, depending on whatever political party is in power, it does not set a good precedent for other issues. Now, it also reduces the power of state legislature, and it is redundant in response to the previous team proposition who talked about a political vendetta. In a democracy, you anyway elect a leader that represents a majority stance on the death penalty of the population itself. So your democracy is not being curved if referendums are not in existence for this death penalty, right? And now these referendums are often reactionary based on the current leader or party in power and would take away from the ability of future legislators and lawyers to operate freely based on legal precedents rather than a referendum of which opinion might change with time, right? And I believe the premise of the House itself is flawed as it focuses on this specific punishment. To elaborate, the referendums are not as significant or would not be as significant as they appear. Now, since the question that is asked is as a reaction to the use of death as a penalty for, let's say, murder, the results are suspect when used as an indication of support for the use of penalties for other crimes, right? And more people would have and do oppose capital punishment with regard to the broad spectrum of crimes for this penalty can be imposed. Now, a Gallup poll bears out this uncertainty. And when American people especially were asked whether the heaviest penalty given to people of the convicted of the worst crimes, 60% of them said it was life in imprisonment rather than the 36% who said it was death. right? And if retribution is the primary aim, and if the public feels that the death penalty is the only thing that can achieve it, the likelihood that any specific criminal that can be rehabilitated is irrelevant. And if some criminals can be helped and others cannot, some criminals can be helped and others cannot, right? That's a stated fact. But the mere fact that is the only effective way to handle some criminals, maybe life imprisonment without eligibility for parole, let's say, does not provide justification for their execution. There is no proof that level of support for the death penalty in legislators is due to overriding concern for punishment or retribution. To the contrary, there is some indication that says that large segments of the population have claimed that vengeance is a primary aim of punishment. This makes innocent lives that are taken insignificant and sets a bad precedent to political issues by letting the population vote on a singular issue instead of educated and elected leaders who should truly be making these critical decisions. And to avoid a situation mimicking the Brexit turnover, I believe that referendum should not be held on the death penalty. Thank you, and I rest my case, but again, not my stance.
Right. Thank you very much, Ayush. Both Devam and Ayush had different approaches to how they would like to tackle each of their stances and made some very important constructives while also acknowledging the side of the refutations, which is a part of the debate, for which I thank them. And we will now be seeing, we will now be looking to the other debaters present here for their scrutiny in their speeches. We'll first take questions towards Devam on his speech and then move on to Ayush. All those with a question to Devam, do voice yourselves.
I have a question.
Right. Anirudh, go ahead.
Yeah, so you said that education should not be given importance when it comes to referendum, but don't you think, sir, that if the people aren't educated, that what are the pros and cons of death penalty and what will it impact be on the crime, the entire purpose of referendum will fall flat on its face because the people don't know about the death penalty?
Sir, actually, that is not what I said. Sir, education is obviously very important while any kind of referendum itself. Sir, understand that what I wanted to say was, or rather what I said was, the fact that the education part of it is not the basic crux of this debate. The debate says that whether do we agree to a referendum or not. So our limitation is only to the fact that whether this principle is correct or not. The question of education is something that we have to leave to the government to imply. It's completely the job of the government to implement it through educational campaigns and other such measures. Thank you, sir.
Right, fair enough, Devam. Thank you for your answer. Thank you for keeping it short. And Anirudh, I hope that answers your question. That in mind, are there any other questions posed towards Devam from the other speakers from the opposition? Right, that in mind, Riddhi or Yash, do either of you have a question towards Devam?
I have a question for Devam, yes.
Right.
Devam, you talked about morals and ethics and how death penalty is not a political agenda, it's more a moral question, while also supporting that we should have a referendum on the death penalty. Do you believe that it is moral or ethical to let the public decide whether the government or the state can sponsor homicide, which is essentially what the death penalty is? Do you think that it's ethical for other people or a majority in the country to decide whether that's okay and that's ethical?
Ma'am, again, I have to get back to the very definition of democracy here. Understand that in case of, as I said, that justice is very subjective. What might be justice to you might not be a justice to me, right? So the question when posed to a referendum takes into account the majority, right? So when the concept of majority comes in, it's the concept of public interest. So as a whole, in a democracy, if we believe that this thing is correct, I guess that is the basic meaning of a democracy, and that is what should be followed.
Suryansh, I just have a small follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for clarifying on the meaning of a democracy and majoritarianism. My question to you is whether it's ethical to have a majority opinion on homicide.
Ma'am, again, the question, what I wanted to say, even through this particular death penalty thing, was the question here is of a very moral standard, right? Now, even when you take up the concept of homicide, it's not something which is very political. It's a moral question. Yeah. So the opinion that a person would be giving on, even in the case of a homicide, it's also going to be of a very moral spectrum, and not influenced by any kind of political influences. So I pretty much, yes, ma'am, the answer to your question would be a yes. Yes, it's very moral and it's very ethical to take in the considerations of the people in case of any kind of democracy.
Right. Fair enough. Riddhi, I hope that answers your question. And Devam, thank you for your responses. We'll now be, or before that, Yash, do you have a question towards Devam?
No, I don't.
Right. Fair enough. Thank you, Yash. And we'll now be taking questions towards Devam's teammate from the opposition, Ayush. Pradyum will take your question first.
Right. So you said you spoke about how there may be political interference, or there may be political influence when referendums are being taken into consideration or being carried out. And so, considering the fact that there is a lot of political campaigning carried out before an election, and that may lead to abuse of power when the party is elected to parliament, don't you think it gives all the more reason to have a referendum rather than let the political party determine what is good for the state or not?
Could you repeat the question, please? Sorry.
So you spoke about how there may be political influence in a referendum, and that may not totally represent what the people feel. Considering the fact that there is a lot of political campaigning before the elections where the party is being elected, don't you think it gives all and there is a lot of influence which might influence people to stray away from their actual opinions? Don't you think it gives all the more reason to have a referendum after the elections are taken place, after the political party has been established? And don't you think okay, you get my question?
Yeah. So, okay. So what I said is that political influence or this political messaging, what I would like to clarify is it leaves an impression or influences not people's beliefs on the referendum, but their information of the situation, right? For example, do you remember the situation in 2016 during before Brexit, the red passes situation that falsely delivered the 350 million pound delivery to the NHS? So misinformation is a constant issue. And sorry, what was the second part of the question? Or if you believe that answers it, I'm fine with that.
Right.
Okay, sure.
All right. Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Pradyum, and thank you, Ayush. We'll now take Anirudh's question before we move on to the judges.
So you said that voting on a single issue is not required or is wrong. So are you considering the entire concept of referendum flawed?
Okay, that's not what I said. I said that an issue of this caliber of a death penalty, there's a certain legal stature, right? And this is the legislators and lawmakers should be the one and the judges in a democracy are the people in power, the elected leaders and lawmakers, right? Those should be the ones who are taking part in or who are making decisions of the caliber of a death penalty, right? And I think I've stated why in my argument. That is, that's exactly why.
Right, fair enough. Hopefully your question, hopefully Anirudh could...
I have a simple yes or no follow-up. Can
I? Just yes or no, Anirudh, please.
Yeah, it's a yes or no. So do you think it is right that if the leaders think that death penalty is required in a democracy like India and the general public thinks we should not have death penalties, do we still need to have death penalty as per the leaders?
I don't think that's a question that can be answered with a yes or no.
Keep it as short as you can. Ayush, we have a time constraint.
Okay, yeah, sure. So the problem with a referendum in a country like India, that goes back to my points. Referendums in this scenario or in certain scenarios being thought would go again and saying that in India, let's say there is misinformation, there is people who are uneducated, there is a certain section of society that is being left out, right? So that's
right.
Basically.
Okay. Thank you, Ayush.
And sorry, could I clarify again? And again, sorry for that.
I think, Ayush, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think the judges have understood what you had to say. I'm so sorry to stop you there. That in mind, thank you to both the losers for their speeches and their responses. Ayush, Riddhi or Yash, do either of you have a question towards Ayush? Shall we move on? Right. Thankfully, we shall now move on to the final team of this debate, which is both Pradyum and Anik representing their team of Dynamo Twice. And I would request either of the two to represent to identify their proposition and opposition speaker.
Pradyum will be speaking as the proposition, and I will be speaking as the opposition.
Right. Pradyum, so we'll be beginning with you, of course. So we have again 4 minutes for your speech. Are you ready? Right. Well, you have 4 minutes. The floor is yours.
Now, they say men's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but men's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Now, it is not up to me to define what is justice and what is injustice when we are debating this motion, when we are talking about the death penalty. However, I do know that justice will not be delivered if we do not take into consideration what people think. Now, I would like to make this point by refuting some of the points made by the opposition. Now, the first opposition speaker spoke about how the media may influence the people before the referendum. So what do? Do we simply abolish the media? The media will always influence people before the election, or the media will always influence people, and essentially the media is what helps us criticize the government, and the media is what helps us take an opinion on what is going on what we might think. Right? The media may or may not may make us be inclined towards a particular decision, and you can't simply say that just because the media will influence the people, it is not correct to hold a referendum. Then he spoke about how mobs may force people to vote against the death penalty. Now, sir, understand the fact that there are today 105 countries as classified by the UN who do not have the death penalty in place and do not practice it in accordance with law or practice. Now, in accordance with that logic, the governments are going against the death penalty, and thereby they are supporting the mob. So the government may or may not support death penalty, and you cannot simply predetermine that the government will support the death penalty, and thereby it is important to take into consideration. It is not important to take into consideration what the people might think, because you have assumed that the people might vote for the death penalty. There are many conflicted opinions, and people do vote against the people vote for the death penalty also. Right. Now, the second speaker of side opposition spoke about how the referendum is not legally binding. It is essentially binding. So yes, exactly. That is the point of democracy. The point of democracy is making the opinions of the people essentially binding. If you make the opinions of the people essentially binding, then exactly that is the point of having this debate. That is the point of discussing whether a referendum should be held or not. Because if a referendum is not essentially binding, then we are not taking into consideration what the people think. Now, then he spoke about how it's already part of the election campaign, then there is no point of having a separate referendum for what the people might think or might not think. So understand the fact that the government will not simply call a referendum out of the blue. It will obviously call a referendum when certain emergencies have occurred, when it has become more disputed in the recent developments. Now understand the fact that there might be conflict of opinion of the same person before the elections and after a crisis has taken place and the referendum has been called. Therefore, it is obviously important to take into consideration what the people currently think rather than what they think before the election, which determines what political party governs the country for 5 years. Now, he also spoke about that the death penalty does not have huge effects on the daily lives of people, and why. And he asked, why does the death penalty hold more significance than other determinants of political stability or of a country's security when we are considering a referendum? Sir, I do not know what to say to that except saying that it is critically important. The death penalty is critically important. That's why it is a commonly debated motion. That is why we are here today. The death penalty is a matter of the right to life or not. And obviously, if there is so much conflicted opinion, there should be a referendum to make it clearer what the people think, and therefore establish a conclusion on whether to go with the abolition of death penalty or whether we should support the death penalty. Therefore, it will not waste time, because essentially it helps Parliament to decide to go. Now, understand the fact that the third speaker of the opposition spoke about how political parties may influence people through before referendum and may exploit their illiteracy. So if a government is exploiting the illiteracy of people, should we really leave it to them to decide whether a person dies or not?
Right. Fair enough. Thank you, Pradyum. We will now. Pradyum made some very interesting refutations in his speech and spoke very articulately upon his own constructives, in relation to his refutations. So we will now see what his teammate Anik has to say from the opposition. Anik, are you with us?
Yes, I hope I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, you are. You are both audible and visible. You have 4 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen of the House, I don't think you should support the death penalty to seek revenge. I don't think that's right. I think the reason to support the death penalty is because it saves other people's lives. And no, this is not me saying it. I'm quoting George Bush while saying this. In 2018, before that, let me just start by defining the word recidivism, which is something that's not been brought up by anyone in today's debate. Now, recidivism is the tendency of a convicted criminal to re-offend. And let me present to you some staggering numbers. In 2018, 83% of convicted felons in the United States were found to be convicted or arrested for the same offense within the next 2 years after being released from prison. That amounts to 1.8 million people in 2018. And since the 21st century, this number has been steadily increasing every single year. Worldwide stats include recidivism re-arrest to be 43%, re-conviction to be 43%, and re-imprisonment to be 30%. Now, these are the facts, ladies and gentlemen, and the facts cannot be denied. The death penalty is probably one of the most objective solutions to handling this crisis, because it is impossible for a criminal to perform the same offense or even to perform different offenses multiple times. It not only serves as a deterrent and ultimate warning for the other people, but it is a solution to lowering the crime rate. Now, there will be people who will argue that each person has a right to live, each person has a basic right to life. But is this right to life still applicable in cases when heinous crimes have been performed by these people? There are countries which have there are retentionist countries which have the death penalty policy for certain serious crimes, for certain crimes which are of a very morally egregious nature. Perhaps this is the model to be followed, not death penalty for all crimes, but only death penalty for the serious crimes which are violating the spirit of humanity. Then again, let me bring to you the concept that many people have spoken today about a referendum being performed, which is not only a waste of time, money, and of resources, but in the current global scenario, it is obviously not preferable. Furthermore, if we take the example of India, as has been brought up by many people, as I've stated before, India has 313 million illiterate people, and education campaigns will not be able to reach all of them. Furthermore, at the national general election, which determines who will lead the country for the next 5 years, 67% of the population of India came out to vote for a matter that is the death penalty, which does not affect all of them. What do you think the voter turnout will be? The fact remains that at the end of the day, it is a legislative matter, and that this rests in the hand of the government. If we give this power of having a referendum for such matters into the hands of the people, not only are we reducing the effective powers of the legislature, but we are putting way too much power into the hands of people. Mostly in India, it is illiterate people, and worldwide, people who might not fully understand the concept, people who might not fully be able to make rational decisions. And as I mentioned before, education campaigns are not going to be effective enough to reach out to all of these people. And again, I bring it up. Most people will commit the same crimes again. That another solution that some people might suggest and that some countries have is psychological treatment for prisoners when in prison. But it is not effective. As per the stats I've told you, it is not at all effective. There will be people who say that 17% of people have not committed crimes again. But given that the cons majorly outweigh the pros, we have to consider the serious possibility of
Anik, wrap
not
up.
having. We have to consider seriously the possibility of having a government, or if the governments of multiple countries, not just India, they make a final lasting decision on the death penalty, because eventually democracy is of the people, by the people, and more importantly, for the people. Furthermore, the death penalty
Anik,
should be
I'm sorry
applied
to
in
interrupt
very
you. We have to wrap up now. Your speech.
last line, last line.
Yeah. Go
Okay.
ahead.
And I started by quoting an American president, so let me end by quoting another. I have said repeatedly that I think the death penalty should be applied in very narrow circumstances for the most egregious of crimes. Barack Obama. Thank you.
Right, fair enough. Thank you for your speech. Thank you for your speech, Anik. That wraps up both the speeches by the team of Dynamo Twice and the speeches for this debate. That in mind, we'll now be taking questions towards Pradyum and then move on to Anik. We'll take Ayush's question first.
Wait, so sorry to, ask this out of the blue, but I would, I would like to propose questions to both speakers, but I would rather propose it to Anik. So what is the...
Um, we first took questions towards Pradyum, Ayush. So if you have a question to Anik, we'd ask you to wait for when
Yeah,
we...
since there were no other questions, I believe, can I still go ahead with it?
Are there any other questions towards Pradyum? To our participants? Well, then yes, Ayush, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So since you're talking about media, right, media and political messaging, right, their impact in political messaging, which is not something I said in my speech, just to clarify. Do you believe that media is solely responsible for political messaging? And do you believe that political messaging is solely done by the media?
So, firstly, when I spoke about the media, I referred to what the first speaker of the opposition said, and the media part had no reference to you. And I didn't speak about media and political messaging. When I spoke about political messaging, I spoke about what you said about how it may influence people in a referendum. But then I said that if the governments are really using political message to exploit the opinions of the people, should they really have the opinion on whether to kill a person through capital punishment or not? Thank you.
Right. Fair enough. Thank you, Pradyum. No, Ayush, we won't be taking a follow-up. Devam, is there a question?
Yes, sir. It's to the opposition.
To the opposition, right. So seeing as there are no more questions from the participants to the proposition, Riddhi or Yash, do either of you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question for them.
All right.
Pratham, you ended your speech and once again repeated just now that if a government exploits illiteracy or weaknesses in their vote base, then why should they be allowed to make a decision on whether people live or die? As other speakers have pointed out in this debate, the government does have the right and does make decisions on whether people live or die, whether people have citizenship or not, even if it's not capital punishment. How do you justify those not being put to a referendum and this especially being put to a referendum? Because every government exploits illiteracy and weaknesses in its voter base.
Ma'am, so your question is basically why, considering the fact that the government does exploit the people's illiteracy, why should this be put to a referendum and why not the other policies?
No, yes, in part yes, but also a larger question would be why are you not acknowledging that a lot of the rules, a lot of the laws that the government makes are also intrinsically related to the right to life of the citizens?
Understand the fact that a death penalty is obviously a very important topic of discussion in a country and with like the domestic affairs of a country. And the people should have the right to a referendum because it is directly applicable to the to a person's right of life, right to life or not. And if the people simply do not have the right to a referendum, then obviously there will be protests breaking out since the government may not deliver the best decisions as they promised when they were elected. Thank you.
I have a question to Pradyum. Since no questions were asked, can I go ahead?
Riddhi, should we allow a question? Actually, no, Pradyum, sorry, Anirudh, I apologize, but because we've already gone past Pradyum, we won't be able to take the question anymore. Unless, Riddhi, would you like to take...
Actually, I want to hear the question.
Fair enough, Yash. On that note, Anirudh, do go ahead.
So you said that death penalty is an important decision and other policies aren't important. Who is going to decide that whether a policy is important or not? Which body is going to decide that something is something has to be put to referendum and something is not?
Again, you are misquoting me. I never said that other things are not important. I am saying that the right to life and the death penalty is a severely important issue. And we know why it is severely important, because it is such a commonly debated motion, because it is such a matter of dispute within countries. It is the base of some certain protests which claim the right to life. Thank you.
Right, fair enough. Thank you, Pradyum, and thank you for the question, Anirudh. We'll now move on to the judges for questions towards. I apologize. We had Devam's question to Anik. Devam, go ahead.
Sir, so you talked about how, since most of the population of India is illiterate, conducting a referendum at this particular time would not be fruitful. Sir, don't you think, sir, the solution to this problem is education and not the cancellation of the idea of having a referendum?
As I said before, that some of the members of the proposition suggested education campaigns specific to the death penalty before having a referendum. And again, I bring to your attention that if people wish to introduce death penalty as a topic to be taught to all generations from the grassroots level, then I would not have anything against that. But reaching 313 million people in a short period of time before a referendum is a logistical nightmare and not feasible.
Sir, could I have a follow-up, please?
Apologetically, no.
Simple yes, no.
Are there any other questions towards Ayush? Your teammate is already asking a question. It is the question. It is the answer that is marked. Devam, go ahead.
So,
all right, I'll leave it.
Sir,
Actually, you know what? I'll leave it up to you, Devam and Ayush. Would you like to hear Ayush's question or Devam's follow-up? I will leave it up to
Devam, up to you.
Fine, Ayush, go ahead. Fine.
All right, with that,
Thank you. Thank you.
Ayush, go ahead.
Right. So, Anik, you spoke about recidivism in the United States, right? And speaking about how 80% of all criminals, or some statistic about those criminals, right? So, considering how most of those cases of recidivism were regarding marijuana possession, do you think marijuana possession warrants execution or the death penalty?
So your information is wrong. Most of these cases were not with relation to marijuana possession. Out of 83%, 40% were with relation to homicides, and 20% were in relation to first degree murder.
Fair enough. Keeping that in mind, I hope your question was answered, Ayush, and I hope it was worth it for your team. And Anik, thank you for the response. Riddhi, Yash, do either of you have a question to Anik?
Just saying, this is like a dispute over something statistical. Ayush, do you have any report you'd like to present that disproves?
Not as of now. Not as of now, sir.
Okay.
I think, can we go ahead with Devam's follow-up, because this was very
I don't know what
it
to do with
doesn't help us score Anik on his rebuttal very much.
Fair enough. On that note, Devam, I guess you're having a lucky day because your follow-up will be taken. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, a very simple question. Sir, do you feel that if most of the population of India was educated, conducting this referendum would have been suitable?
As I mentioned repeatedly in my speech, if we put a legislative matter into the hands of the general public, most of which is at the moment illiterate, a large part of which at the moment is illiterate, it makes a legislature of a country redundant. And furthermore, if in a hypothetical situation the entire country was literate and rational enough to make such decisions, my answer would still be the same, that it takes the legislature has the function of the legislature is to enact the laws, and it's been elected by the people. So I don't see the point of having a referendum for issues, especially issues like this, which do not affect the entire population of a country.
Fair enough. Thank you, Anik, and thank you, Devam. Hopefully that helped you, Riddhi and Yash, mark you with more. And Riddhi, Yash, do either of you have a question to Anik? Yash?
No, I don't think I do. I think I'm fine.
Okay. With that, we have come to the end of this debate, and before we wrap up and move towards the results, I would request the audience, if there are for questions, if they have any to any of the speakers, to please voice themselves in case they want to. We had a few questions last time, and in case you have questions, feel free to voice yourselves. Is there anyone with a question? Right. So seeing as there are none, we will now move forward. And before I pass the mic over to Riddhi and Yash to talk about what they felt about the debate, yes, Ayush?
Right. So since I found an article stating, not an article, it was a study stating recidivism statistics, which very clear recidivism statistics. Could I send it to the judges or in the chat to everyone?
Fair enough, Ayush. Just send it to the judges. That in mind, what we
Anik, where are your statistics from?
I'll find the link. Wait.
Okay, yeah.
Right. While we wait on that, I would like to mention what I attempted to earlier, but I had some net difficulties for which Riddhi graciously took over. Thank you, Riddhi. I wanted to talk about the tournament of the second tournament of the Flojos that is in association with Project Suffer, a student-led initiative that is in association with this tournament that is working towards helping migrant workers return to their homes safely and soundly. So far, they've sent over 153 migrant workers back to their homes, which is just for a student-run initiative that has been running for about a month and a half, quite impressive. And they plan on sending another 150 to 60 home every month and at an increasing rate. That in mind, all the proceeds of this tournament will be going to them, and we will also be accepting any amount of donations throughout the duration of this tournament via Paytm, Google Pay, or a direct transfer, for which you can contact us on our Instagram page. That's what that was. So to those watching, I would request you to help out in any way possible. I can guide you through the process on our Instagram page. And we hope to have some very productive work that we can help Project Suffer with. That in mind, we will now move on to what all of you are waiting for at this point, which is the results. Before which, Riddhi and Yash, I would request you to please say a few words about the debate that we just saw today.
All right. Thanks for coming, guys. Thanks for debating well. I think it was super productive. I think the general standard of debate obviously was much higher than the previous round. Everyone was better from the last time I've seen them. Today, I think it really came down to structure and be multi-dimensional in your speech rather than anything else. The difference came down to bringing more stuff out, finding new ways to talk about something, and yeah, I think that's about it for me. Good effort. Good luck for next round for those who make it through, and even for those who don't on today. Yash, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Guys, understand that statistics are a tool. Statistics aren't your constructives. Don't waste too much time on them. Speak in an engaging manner. I think oration in general was very high for this round. But again, these are things that everyone can improve on. So I'll tell you something that I tell everyone that I teach MUN or debate to. You should always try to explain something to the audience like you're doing it to a 5-year-old. You shouldn't, if you speed through, especially in a debate, I used to do this a lot when I started public speaking. If you speed through your speech, then no one is engaged, including judges in several debates will just lose interest in what you're saying. In general, you guys were really good orators. So well done on that. But you guys should focus on this in the future. Try not to read out from anywhere. Take points down. And I think that is one place where everyone can improve. Logic was pretty good in this debate. Research too. I think some of you were a little bit under-researched. And even when you're using rebuttal, don't base your entire speech on that. Try to show that you have some constructives to add too, because if you're using your entire speech to break down other people's speeches in this format of debate, I've been told that isn't how you're meant to do it. So try to use some constructives too. And yeah, I think in general, the standard of debate was better than I expected. So well done, everyone.
Right. Thank you, Yash. Well, if I were to say anything, I couldn't have phrased what Yash or Riddhi said any better. I wish both the teams qualifying the very best of luck for the finals, and and to the others who don't make it there, I hope to see you in the debates after this tournament, and any others, because like Yash and Riddhi both said, all of you had some very good speeches to make, and in my capacity, I do believe that it was quite fun to watch for the limited although I wasn't here at the very beginning. Now that in mind, over to Riddhi and Yash to declare both the two teams qualifying as well as the best speaker for today's debate.
Yes.
Riddhi, do you want to do it?
Go ahead with teams. I'll announce best speaker. Let's do it that way.
Yeah, okay. So I think two of the teams were very good. I think not applicable and losers were both very good today. But the only difference that Riddhi and I could see was that losers were better rounded. They had a good amount of, they were really good orators. They had very good logic, research, everything. And that is some place we thought did not have applicable, slightly lost out. But that being said, the totals were very close and both teams did exceptionally well. And in losers, again, both speakers were extremely good. Like, this is a very high level of debate, and this is definitely much better than I would have expected. I think I've seen Ayush in MUNs earlier, and this is definitely like a huge improvement. Well done, Ayush.
I'll take that as a compliment, Yash.
Yes, it is intended as a compliment.
All right, yeah. So, congratulations, losers, for winning best team and not applicable for winning first runner-up. Best speaker today goes to Devam from losers. Devam, really well done. Everyone, as I said, and Yash also mentioned, everyone was really good. But we thought the way you looked at it was so different from how everyone else looked at it. And this really, really appealed to us. So yeah, that's the results. Over to you, Suryansh.
Also, guys, just putting it out there, Devam and Ayush were extremely close in marking.
Yeah,
like I think they were
true.
tied on one sheet, and Devam took over by like a point in another.
Is Suryansh still here?
He's Suryansh are muted. He's talking.
All right, I apologize. Thank you to both Riddhi and Yash for your words, and of course for joining in. I really value your feedback, and congratulations, ironically, to the losers for winning, and to the team of not applicable as well for qualifying to the finals. I wish you the best of luck. And as Devam put it at the start of his speech, it was a very different look to the stance. As compared to the other speeches. So it was quite true indeed, Devam. Other than that, I have nothing much else to say. Other than well done, guys. We hope we can see you on the other debates that we have on the floor is yours. And other than that, is there anything you guys would like to say before we wrap up? Fair enough. Well, in that case, that's what that was, and we'll see you on the next one. Okay, thanks, guys.